in this current era of chronic stress, it's easy to think that a lot of the behaviors that are a result of flight, fight, or freeze are personality traits because we experience them so often. We might think that flight is only running away, but actually it can be withdrawal and escaping. Fight, isn't just fighting. Sometimes it can be blame, trying to regain control. And freeze or shock doesn't just happen in acute traumatic events, it can happen in social contexts as well. And so starting to understand a lot of these behaviors that really are a reflection of our state aren't personality traits. You're not born with them. I mean, you're born coded in, but they're not who you are. They're not just how it is. They're actually a reflection of your defense mechanisms, your amygdala turning on and your prefrontal cortex turning off. And so to help explain this better, these are stages in a stress response or a stress cycle. And this could be any amount of time. It could be in seconds, minutes, hours, days, decades. So essentially you have the safe and social phase, the fight and flight, and then the freeze and fawn. And so you hopefully start in the safe and social, and then you get activated and you go into the fight or flight. And then if you actually feel like you can't do anything in that fight or flight, it can tip all the way into the freeze and fawn. And then to actually complete this stress cycle, you need to come back down. And so if you've ever experienced a freeze response, you actually go back into your fight or flight first. This has once happened with me. I went into a freeze response during a meeting, or I also did it in front of my laptop. And essentially it was getting up and moving. It was getting out of that meeting. That's a flight response, just getting as far away from the trigger as possible before then coming back down into safe and social. And what can happen throughout our days or our life is we may not even start at safe at social. We may start, the alarm turns on, you're jolted awake. You might start in a fight or flight response, and then you kind of get more fight or flight, and then you drop down, maybe a little bit safe and social, still quite activated, and you kind of just up and down through the fight and flight, safe and social. Maybe at some point you've gone up into the freeze and back down and up and down and up and down. When really what we want is, as much time in the safe and social as possible. If something does happen, it goes up and then goes down fairly quickly back into safe and social. Not the chronic stress of living your life in these stress responses or sympathetic responses, or mobilized and immobilized, depending on what scientific terminology you want to use. But essentially, the aim is to spend more time in the safe and social and less time in the flight or fight or freeze. Because when you spend more time in the safe and social, that's where you have behaviors like the authentic self-expression, the calm boundary setting, the listening deeply without needing to interact, the playful humor, genuine eye contact, feeling present in your body. All these behaviors that we associate with having a relaxed but a happy time, being creative, being collaborative, connecting with people. These are all behaviors that happen when you are in that when your nervous system isn't on high alert for threats all the time. Behaviors that may be mistaken for personality traits but are actually a flight response might be quitting when something's happened and wanting to chuck it in the bin or leave, or you've just had enough, you don't want to deal with it anymore. And just if you become aware that something is a flight response, it doesn't mean you shouldn't get away from it. It doesn't always mean that. It's just good to become aware of it. For example, the job that I was at recently, I just wanted to quit so bad. I wanted to run away so bad. It was like I was up and down through all the stress cycles, flight, fight, freeze, back and forth. And I'm so glad I quit. I'm so glad I left. I'm so glad that I utilize that flight response to finally make the decision to get out of there. But what can happen is, like, if you have a friend or a partner who you do care about deeply and you're being triggered, your flight response is being triggered, then you may start having thoughts about, like, I want to leave them. Why am I even doing this? I want to get out of here. And that's not your intuition. That is your flight response. Any other types of either withdrawal or avoidance or escaping, for example, certain procrastinating to avoid certain tasks, constantly job hopping, reinventing yourself, some fight response behaviors that might be mistaken for personality traits. I kind of mentioned a few, but the blaming, the wanting to punish, the wanting to regain control, even micromanagement are all forms of that activated fight response. It's a stress response. Sarcasm, over criticizing yourself, over criticizing others, harsh judgment. And this is, it's so good to know this, right? Because you may think you don't get along with someone, but really you're both just in an activated stress response. Like, imagine if you were both in the safe and social, like how much more understanding and, open-minded you could be to that person, right? And I'll get into more details about, what you can do before, during, and after a stressful event. But, if you do notice yourself constantly getting frustrated or snappy, it's kind of like, what happened prior to that? What has been triggering that? Because the more you start to see these behaviors as not as just how you are, but actually as stress responses, you can start to look into what's actually triggering that stress response. You can actually start to see where you can make improvements and experience life from that satisfaction, that joy, that happiness, that peacefulness, as opposed to always, snapping, avoiding, phrasing, snap, avoid, phrase. Phrase is a little bit more obvious, but even I didn't know what was going on. I thought I was just going into shock when I was sitting in front of my laptop, staring at the screen. It's almost a tongue twister. I knew I was going into shock when I would sit and stare at the screen, and it was like my brain was short-circuiting, and I would get these cold sweats and this anxiety increasing, but then at the same time I couldn't get my thoughts to work. And it gets to the point in a freeze response, it almost gets to the point where it's easier to dissociate than it is to feel anything. And actually dropping that stress cycle, dropping back down from freeze into fight or flight, is freezes the dissociation. And when you are moving through a stress cycle, actually feeling the emotion, like feeling the sadness, the anger, the grief, means you're actually moving through the stress cycle. It's not getting worse, it's actually getting better. And then there's the fawn response, which of course is better well known now, which only really happens in social creatures, but essentially it's the self-blame, the over-apologizing, downplaying your own needs. It's okay, whatever works for you, even when you're hurt or inconvenienced. It's over-functioning for others. It's doing more for others, even if it inconveniences you. Really trying to appease and almost submission type strategies. This is where the people-pleasing comes in. The people-pleasing as a result of conflict, which can then become people-pleasing to avoid conflict. So many of these behaviors I've personally experienced, I've personally identified with, and I honestly thought that was just like how I was. I'd suddenly become someone, or I just was someone who was super anxious, who would react, who couldn't commit to something for more than a period of time. And before I get into ways of how to reduce these stress responses and spend more time in the safe and social as opposed to the fight and flight, freeze and fawn, let me introduce myself. So I'm Molly Holly. I spent 6 years at university studying various sciences, from brain and behavior to chemistry, and then I spent another 5 years in corporate leadership, and then I've done over 400 hours of coaching, hypnosis, and breathwork training. I've helped clients one-to-one go from anxious about the smallest things to calm and resilient even in the face of big life changes. And so if you want to work towards feeling less stress, whether it's less chronic stress or just to handle high pressure or high stress situations a lot better. There are things you can do before, during, and after. After is so important. After a trigger or a stressful event happens. So before a stressful event, so as you're going through your life, you want to think about what you can control, as opposed to turning all the stress activation switches on before 9 a.m. No. No, settle. You want to think about, what you can control. So as opposed to flicking on all the stress activation switches before 9 a.m., think about which switches you can turn off. What about your alarm, as opposed to having the burr, burr alarm when I used to have to wake up at 4 a.m. darkness? Obviously, it was hard to wake up, so I put one of my favorite songs on as an alarm instead. Anything too soft, unfortunately, I wouldn't wake up. But even if I did jolt awake, at least I would listen to the length of the song, listen to the lyrics, and it would make me feel quite relaxed. It would just not be so stressful and activating, as opposed to grabbing your water, grabbing your coffee, getting in the car, driving to work, getting on the phone, yelling at someone in traffic. It's which moments can you just pause, just slow down? It's not necessarily about adding more particular habits to your routine. It's where can you already adjust the micro habits to support a more relaxed nervous system as opposed to a more activated nervous system. For example, drinking water. So how many of you drink water like this? Let's all drink water together. And you can tell me if you drink water like this, as opposed to, grabbing your water bottle, getting in the car, drinking it while you're driving, drinking it while you're sitting at a desk. Just breath in, and then take a sip. And then a breath. And another sip. How many of you actually drink your water like that, for example? What about drinking your coffee like that? There was months I was just rushing through work, drinking coffee while I was working. And one day I thought about this and I decided to use my senses while drinking my coffee. And, I smelt the coffee and I was like, oh, it's a bit burnt. And I took a sip and it was disgusting. I was like, how have I been drinking this coffee for months? And it's just because I was so just go, that I didn't even give myself a chance to taste what I was drinking and eating. And so it's taking those moments, in between work periods of active work, whether you're concentrating really hard, as opposed to straight into the next thing. Take a moment to get some fresh air, to get some sunshine, because these will start to bring you back down into that safe and social, as opposed to constantly bit more activated, and then you're, having a go at someone or quitting your job or, all the things, or just sitting at your desk overwhelmed, not really sure what to do, anxious, right? These are stress responses. It's not because of who you are, essentially. And so these are all the things beforehand. What can you control? Now, during a stressful event, meet yourself where you're at. So, for example, I love listening to, there's obviously breath work. I've got a few of those either already available or coming out. But, for example, if you're in the car or at your desk, and maybe even breath work isn't the, logistically possible in that moment. I don't mean calm breathing. I mean the kind of breath that meets you where you're at. Is I used to have a different song for each emotion. And so, for example, if I was really angry, I would just listen. There was a heavy metal song that I literally just listen on repeat. Or, if you're sad, obviously if you listen to a sad song, it'll make you cry. But essentially, if you want to do this, I think it works really well, is, pick a song that fits that emotion and just listen to it on repeat, like the same song on repeat, on repeat. Because what will happen is you'll start to get kind of like entrained, I suppose, with that song. But the good thing with a song is they end, right? And so you'll get to a point where the song ends and it'll play again, and it's like, okay, I'm bored of this song and I'm bored of this emotion, because you've essentially validated that emotion, you've met yourself where you're at, and then because the song's ended, it's also at a subconscious level ended the intensity of that emotion and helped you then dip back down, gradually completing that stress cycle. When it comes to breath work, you want to be doing a breath that is similar to the emotion you're feeling, as opposed to, say, if you're angry and then trying to do slow breathing, you want to do quite a forceful breath and then gradually decrease the intensity of that breath, and that'll bring you out of that activated state and into a down-regulated state. It's the same when you're stressed. It's actually, if you do fast breathing and then progress to slow breathing, you got to meet yourself where you at, and then move from there. After a stressful event, this is the part no one thinks about. You just like get over one stressful event, you're just slightly less stressed, and then another one happens, and then you get over that and you're slightly less stressed, and another one happens, where you really need to, particularly the more intense it's been, the more you need to down-regulate, regulate, self-care, look after yourself, like really get yourself out of any of that adrenaline and that cortisol into a feeling where you can be like, oh, I can relax, I can sleep. For example, I used to do first response, and at 1 a.m. there was this incident which was high pressure, high stress, life-threatening. Fortunately, me and the crew got it under control, but essentially the next day I was like adrenaline wired until 1 p.m. Fortunately, coincidentally, that next day I'd planned to go to the zoo with my friends, and it was actually, at that point, I had no idea about any of this. I had no idea about breath work, nervous system, subconscious, none of it. But what I knew is that being around animals, being around nature was actually such a good idea at that point in time. I'm all for, animal therapy, nature therapy. Don't even need to call it therapy, right? Just like hanging out with animals or spending time in nature are actually forms of, regulating yourself. And yeah, it wasn't until 12 hours later where I actually felt that adrenaline drop off and actually finally felt fatigued enough to sleep, right? And if I had known about breath work, I probably would have just been doing a bunch of breath work until I fell asleep. And to really get to know what regulates you, of course, breath work's good, but it doesn't only have to be breath work. Whether it's self-care, a bath, when I was working fly in, fly out after a stressful day, like just before the shower, I'll just like self-massage all my shoulders and my neck and my face. It was like, oh, it was so good. I should keep doing that. It's like, because now I work for myself, I don't really deal with as many stressful situations. So I actually don't do that self-care as much, but I think I will start doing that again. But yeah, just get to know what really regulates you, ideally straight after the event. But obviously, if you're at work, then, at the end of the day. For example, with puppies. Yeah. I say, how puppies are all crazy and psycho, to actually meet them where they're at, to, move around a whole lot, and then to the same intensity they are, and then gradually soften your voice and gently pat them, and then it helps them relax because it's meeting them where they're at. And so by meeting yourself where you're at, getting to a point where your stress isn't as activated, and then going further and actually relaxing yourself where you don't feel that scattered, on edge, adrenaline type energy anymore. And the thing is with chronic stress or just a stressful life is it's a habitual cycle. And so there's many entry points into this stress cycle, but it also means there's many opportunities to pattern interrupt that stress cycle. For example, the alarm again, right? Setting a quite intense alarm is an entry point into the stress cycle. It's going to jolt you awake like there's something, an emergency to get to, aka your work. But that's also an opportunity to do something different, to interrupt that stress cycle, to wake up slowly and easily. If driving to work or checking your emails or checking your notification also triggers a stress response, also maybe reading the news, right, gets you into an activated state where you start feeling snappy or anxious or, procrastinating or anything like this, then that is also an opportunity to do something differently, to relax yourself before you open your emails, maybe listen to calm music while you're looking at your emails, do a breath work before you have to respond to a certain text message. And then there's, of course, the other people in your life. And so if you've got, say, your partner or kids coming home yelling and screaming or just stress themselves and you're already in a slightly activated state, well, then you two are just going to co-dysregulate each other into, fighting or avoidance or the kind of interactions that don't feel like the kind of relationship you want to have. And so can you ask that person can you both, calm yourselves down before you interact again, whether you're the one coming home or you're the one already at home? Can you, ask that person, like, can you just, before you walk in the door, just check yourself, do a breath flow before, and if, they're not open to it, maybe you lead by example, and before anyone gets home or before you walk in the door, you just notice how you're feeling. And if you're feeling, on that verge of anxiety, on that verge of like something could really, tip you over, then what can you do to regulate yourself, to really relax? Because what will happen is if you are in that rest and relaxed state, even if you interact with someone that's super stressed, what's going to happen is you're going to co-regulate them back into a relaxed state, as opposed to, unless of course they really trigger you, but if you're quite relaxed, and, obviously if they're really upset, it's quite a mismatch. But if they're just a bit stressed and you're quite relaxed, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to co-regulate and down-regulate. And this co-regulation or co-dysregulation is something we do all the time. That's why in places where there can be a lot of stress or high pressure situations going on, people can bond quite quickly because you essentially experience that together, and then you might be able to talk about it, validate it, laugh it off, co-regulate each other together and down-regulate each other together, and then you create a bond through that. Or, something stressful happens to you and then you go see your work buddy and then down-regulate. And right, it's like in a healthy world, we're going to be creating connections and friendships because, people inspire us or motivate us or entertain us, or just we have shared likes. But oftentimes we form bonds as a result of needing to down-regulate, of being able to down-regulate each other. And it's not a bad thing. It's I guess it's a necessary adaptation, being social creatures. But, if you are a solopreneur working at home on your own, then it may be something you didn't know you were missing, right? And so I hope this video clears up that a lot of behaviors that you may accidentally thought are personality traits because they've repeated for so long are actually just a reflection of your state, your biochemical, biological, neurological state, and not who you authentically are. Because when you change your state, you change the stories and you change your stress.